The last thing Saul heard before his kingdom died was not the roar of a battlefield. It was not iron breaking bone on Mount Gilboa. It was not the scream of his sons. It was a sentence spoken in a low room, over a dirt floor, by a dead man who sounded angry that he had been woken. That is the part most retellings hide from you. They rush toward the battle because battles are easier to understand. Men charge. Kings fall. Bodies stay where history can count them. But Saul's real death happened earlier, in darkness, inside a house built low enough to survive a purge, where a hunted woman opened the earth and the old prophet rose from underneath it. The monster in this story is not the witch. It is not even the ghost. The monster is silence. And by the end, silence will prove more merciful than the answer Saul begged to hear. If you're watching this late somewhere in the States, drop your city or state and the local time below. I want to know who else is sitting in the dark with this story. Before Endor, Saul was still technically a king. Men still lowered their eyes when he entered. Armor still recognized the shape of his body. The camp still arranged itself around him, as if his presence could hold a nation together. But power can become theatrical long after authority has died, and on that night, the theater was cracking. Across the black ridges of Shunem, the Philistine army burned in clusters of distant fire. Not one fire, not a line a camera could frame cleanly. Thousands of low, orange wounds flickering across the hills, each one a cooking pit, a watch flame, a marker of men waiting for morning. In the Israelite camp, the wind pushed through tent cloth and snapped loose ropes against wooden stakes. Shields knocked softly against one another. Harness rings clicked with a cold, regular rhythm, not like preparation, but like a patient countdown. Saul could hear it because he had stopped sleeping. The body of a sleepless commander becomes a second battlefield. His hands trembled when they should have rested on the hilt. His mouth tasted metallic from hunger and old panic. His skin carried the sour smell of sweat trapped under royal leather. Every sound arrived sharpened, the scrape of a servant's sandal, the hiss of a dying coal, the distant cough of a soldier trying not to sound afraid. Fear did not visit him as an emotion. It settled into the machinery of the body. It tightened the throat. It narrowed the eyes. It convinced the heart that every shadow had chosen him personally. This is where the old story becomes less like theology and more like a psychological autopsy. Saul had not collapsed in a single night. He had been coming apart for years, piece by piece, in front of people who still needed him to look like a king. He had lived under the pressure of constant war, against the Philistines, against the Amalekites, against neighboring powers that did not merely threaten borders but threatened existence. Ancient kings did not lead from clean strategy rooms. They stood close enough to smell the opened bodies. They heard men begging for water through broken teeth. They watched captives turned into warnings. Saul had seen the prophet Samuel hack Agag to pieces, not as a metaphor, not as a stained glass image, but as flesh under an old man's blade. The sound of that kind of obedience does not leave the nervous system. It hides inside it. And then there was David. The boy with the harp. The boy with the sling. The boy the women sang about louder than they sang about Saul. In another court, in another century, David might have been a political inconvenience. In Saul's court, he became a shape onto which every private terror could be projected. The king heard music and detected conspiracy. He saw loyalty and recognized replacement. He watched Oth standing near him and felt the future leaning away. More than once his hand found a spear before reason could intervene. Imagine the room after the spear struck the wall, the harp strings still trembling, dust shaken loose from plaster, servants frozen between the instinct to protect David and the greater terror of touching the king. Nobody in that room needed a diagnosis. They needed to survive the next breath. The text calls Saul's torment an evil spirit. Modern language reaches for other names: psychosis, severe depression, manic agitation, combat trauma, a mind mutilated by power and fear. But ancient language may have understood something modern language sometimes misses. A spirit is not always a creature. Sometimes it is an atmosphere. Sometimes it is what enters a house when everyone learns which subjects can no longer be spoken aloud. Saul's court had become a weather system of avoidance. People watched the king carefully. They removed sharp words before he heard them. They learned to praise without sounding false, and to disagree without sounding alive. This is how a ruler becomes most isolated at the exact moment he is most surrounded. Then the final disaster arrived, and it arrived as absence. Saul inquired of the Lord, and nothing answered. No dream carried a strategy through the night. No prophet stepped forward with a word. No sacred object clicked into certainty. In the ancient world, divine guidance was not decoration. It was infrastructure. It held together law, war, legitimacy, and sanity. A king who could not hear from God was not merely unlucky, he was disconnected from the power grid of reality. The three official channels failed in three different ways, and each failure tightened the room around him. Dreams were the most private channel, the place where a king could receive guidance without witnesses, without public humiliation, without the terrible vulnerability of asking in front of men who still expected certainty from him. But sleep had become either impossible or useless. When Saul closed his eyes, if he closed them at all, the mind did what traumatized minds do. It replayed threat. It rehearsed betrayal. It pulled old violence from storage and dressed it in new faces. Prophets, the public channel, were no help either. Samuel was buried, and the priestly network Saul should have trusted had been cut down at Nob under his own command. The third channel, the oracular channel, was the most humiliating absence of all, because it had not merely disappeared, it had defected into David's orbit. The sacred yes and no, the Urim and Thummim, now belonged to the future Saul feared. Every path to clarity had become a corridor leading to someone else, and Saul knew why some of the channels were gone. Samuel was dead in Ramah. The priests of Nob were dead by Saul's own command. Abiathar, the one priest who survived, had fled to David with the ephod, and with it the Urim and Thummim, the sacred technology by which yes and no could become the voice of God. That detail is one of the cruelest in the entire story. Saul was not standing before a silent universe because all revelation had vanished. Revelation had moved. It had crossed the political border and entered the camp of the young rival he feared most. Somewhere out there, David could ask and receive. Saul could ask and hear only the inside of his own skull. That is not ordinary despair. That is sensory deprivation with religious architecture. It is a man locked outside his own God while another man holds the key. There is a modern shape to this kind of panic. It resembles the leader who has fired every honest advisor and then mistakes the silence around him for betrayal. It resembles the parent who has made truth dangerous in the house, then cannot understand why the children no longer speak. Saul's tragedy was not that nobody warned him. It was that he had turned warning into a capital offense. By the time he needed a voice that would contradict him, he had already filled the land with graves. Nob mattered because it revealed how far Saul had already gone before Endor ever appeared on the map. The priests there were not enemy soldiers. They were the men who kept the sacred routines breathing. Bread, ephod, counsel, intercession. The ordinary maintenance of a world where God could still be approached. Saul saw assistance to David and converted it into treason. In that conversion, paranoia became policy. Once a ruler turns priests into suspects, he does not merely kill people. He damages the instruments by which his own future self might be rescued. Endor is the invoice for Nob. The woman in hiding is not an accidental character. She is what remains after a kingdom murders its legitimate interpreters. So when he prayed that night, the horror was not that God shouted condemnation. The horror was that nothing happened. No wind shifted, no lamp flared, no dream image broke across his mind. The camp remained cold. The Philistine fires remained steady. The silence did not feel empty. It felt occupied by refusal. Saul's breath shortened. His stomach cramped around nothing because he had not eaten all day. He probably told himself hunger sharpened the spirit, that fasting made room for an answer. But the body does not become holy just because it is starved. It becomes brittle, and brittle things break loudly. He summoned his servants and gave the order that reversed his public life. Find me a woman who is a medium, not a prophet, not a priest, not a warrior, a woman hidden somewhere in the land. From the very class of people he had driven underground, earlier in the name of religious order. Saul had cut off mediums and spiritists from Israel. That phrase sounds clean in translation. Cut off, as if policy simply erased them. But purges are not clean. They turn neighbors into informants. They make doors dangerous after sunset. They force old women to bury tools under hearthstones and teach their daughters which noises mean soldiers. Somewhere in Endor, a woman had survived Saul's holiness. Now Saul needed her. This is the uncommon center of the story. The medium is usually treated as a prop, a forbidden doorway in human form. But she is the only living person in the narrative who sees the situation clearly from beginning to end. She recognizes the legal danger before Saul admits his identity. She recognizes the apparition before Saul can see it. She recognizes the king's collapse before his servants know how to move. And after all of that, she feeds him. The person Saul's regime tried to erase becomes the last human being to preserve his life long enough for judgment to finish its work. History calls her the Witch of Endor because it has always been easier to label a woman than to admit she understood the king better than his court did. Think about the practical intelligence required to survive as her. She would need to know who in a village talked too much after wine. She would need more than one storage place for forbidden objects, and a way to make a room look ordinary if boots hit the threshold. She would need to recognize grief in the dark, because grief is the usual customer of the dead. People do not seek ghosts when life is generous. They seek them when the last conversation ended wrong, when a body was buried too quickly, when a question remained inside the living like a fishhook. Saul may be the most famous visitor to her door, but he was not the first desperate person to bring the smell of panic into that house. But before he could reach her, Saul had to erase himself. The Hebrew word behind his disguise carries the idea of concealment, search, self-masking. Chaphas. It appears around kings who try to slip under the eye of doom. Ahab disguised himself before battle. Josiah hid his royal identity at Megiddo. But disguise is never only fabric. For Saul, Chaphas was the unmaking of kingship with his own hands. The armor came off first. Imagine the sound. Not noble, not ceremonial. Metal striking packed earth with a dead, heavy clank. Breastplate. Greaves. Royal cloak. The objects that told everyone who he was dropped one by one into the dark. Underneath, his tunic was damp. His skin carried the chill of exposed sweat. He pulled common cloth over himself, rough against the neck, smelling of storage, smoke, and another man's labor. A crown is supposed to make a human larger than himself. That night, Saul made himself smaller. There is a reason disguise stories cling to doomed kings. Disguise lets power pretend it can become ordinary for a night, as if fate is a guard at a gate who can be tricked by borrowed clothing. But fate in these stories is never looking at the cloak. It is listening for the pattern. Ahab changed garments, and the random arrow still found the joint in his armor. Josiah altered his appearance, and Megiddo still received him. Saul's Chaphas belongs to that same lineage of desperate theater. The costume does not hide the king from judgment. It reveals that the king has finally admitted judgment is hunting him. He reduced himself to a shadow moving through his own kingdom, escorted by only 2 men. Not an army, not a guard of honor. 2 men who knew enough to keep their faces hard and their mouths shut. The path to Endor was not a grand descent through Gothic scenery. It was mud, low brush, moonlight caught on stones, the animal smell of damp fields, and the paranoia of every sound. A twig cracked, and 3 armed men stopped breathing. Wind moved through dry grass, and it became a scout. A jackal called somewhere beyond the ridge, and it carried the pitch of accusation. They were traveling through a land that Saul officially controlled and personally feared. That is another sign of a dying ruler, when a king must sneak through his own territory to commit the act that will tell him whether he can survive. The kingdom has already become foreign soil beneath his feet. Every village could contain someone who remembered the Purge. Every path could hold Philistine movement. Every face, if seen by moonlight, could become a witness. The mud sucked at their sandals as if the ground itself wanted to keep them there, halfway between camp and Underworld. Endor waited not as a haunted forest, but as a practical hiding place. The dwelling would have been low, possibly partly sunk, mud, brick, and earth, built for concealment more than comfort. No towers, no dramatic silhouettes, just a structure that knew how to disappear. Inside, the air would have been warmer than the night, but fouler, thick with old smoke, damp clay, stored grain, animal musk, and the faint copper smell that clings to spaces where blood has touched earth before. The oil lamp did not brighten the room. It weakened the darkness in one trembling circle. The woman saw strangers at her door after dark, and her body would have understood the danger before her mind finished naming it. Armed men, covered faces, urgency, a request that could kill her. When they demanded that she bring up the dead, she resisted with the precision of someone who had survived by noticing traps. "You know what Saul has done," she warned. "You know how he cut off the mediums and the spiritists from the land. Why are you laying a snare for my life?" In that moment, the disguised king listened to his own violence thrown back at him by one of its survivors. And then Saul committed the most grotesque sentence of his reign. "As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing." Listen to what that means. He used the name of the God who forbade the act to protect the woman performing it. He wrapped illegality in sacred language. He borrowed the authority of the silence that had rejected him. This was not clever hypocrisy. It was collapse. Saul had reached the stage where religious vocabulary had separated from religious obedience and become a tool, like a knife, like a mask, like a key forced into the wrong lock. The oath probably comforted no one in the room. Not the woman, not the servants, maybe not even Saul. But it opened the next door, and every person present knew there would be no clean way back through it. The medium asked who she should bring up. Saul gave the name that had been haunting the kingdom longer than any Philistine army. Samuel. The room had a texture after that name. Clay walls seemed to tighten around the breath. The oil lamp bent in the moving air. Outside, the night pressed against the door. Saul had not come for comfort. Not really. He had come for the one voice he had ignored while it lived. Because dead voices cannot be politically managed. That was his mistake. He assumed death made Samuel safer. But the dead do not become gentle just because the living become desperate. To understand what happened next, you have to remove every image later centuries painted onto the scene. No crystal ball, no pointed hat, no theatrical smoke curling over a table. The ritual at Endor belonged to an older, heavier world. The word connected with the medium does not merely suggest a vague spirit. Across neighboring cultures, cognates point toward a ghost pit, a physical opening in the earth, a place where the living made a wound in the floor and treated that wound as a mouth. The ancient dead did not drift down like pale mist. They were below. They belonged to dust, to depth, to silence. If you wanted them, you did not look upward. You dug. That older world was not primitive because it believed the earth mattered. It was sophisticated in a way modern people often refuse to be. It understood grief as spatial. The dead were not simply gone. They were relocated. Below meant something. Dust meant something. The body returned to the ground. So the voice, if it could be reached at all, would have to come through the ground's dark memory. In Mesopotamian and Anatolian rituals, pits could become temporary mouths between orders of being. Offerings were not decoration. They were invitations written in food, blood, metal, and smell. To a modern viewer, this may seem grotesque. To an ancient mind, it was mechanics. You did not think your way into the underworld. You built an access point. So the woman lowered herself toward the floor. The packed dirt was cold under her knees. Her fingers pressed into grit darkened by old smoke and household grease. The servants probably shifted back instinctively, though none of them would admit it. Saul, who had ordered armies, who had heard the screams of battle, now had to wait while a hunted woman opened the only channel left to him. The sound would have been small at first, fingernails scraping soil, a tool biting into hardened earth, the breath of someone trying not to shake. Dirt loosened. Dust rose and stayed low in the lamplight. The air tasted bitter. The ritual pit was not symbolic to the people in that room. It was architecture, a threshold in the world view that shaped the story. The dead inhabited Sheol, the shadowed underworld, the pit, the place of ruin, the place where praise faded because breath had ended. Not heaven, not hellfire, not reward or punishment as later imagination would organize it. Sheol was the leveling dark. Kings and servants, prophets and fools, everyone descended into the same subterranean silence. The dead were called Rephaim, shades, remnants, once mighty names reduced to whispers under the ground. They did not possess the bright agency of living men. They existed as aftermath. This also explains why the silence of Sheol was so terrifying. Later imaginations often preferred dramatic afterlives because punishment and reward are narratively satisfying. Fire tells a story. Paradise tells a story. Sheol resists story. It is the flattening place. It does not care whether a man died singing psalms or screaming in battle. It receives the breathless. That makes Samuel's return feel less like a miracle and more like a crime against rest. Saul is not pulling a soul down from heaven. He is dragging a shade upward from the cosmic basement, forcing speech back into a domain defined by speechlessness. No wonder the first words are not comfort. No wonder they sound like anger. That is why necromancy was not just forbidden information gathering. It was a violation of cosmic geography. To summon the dead was to tear open the boundary that kept the silent silent. It was to force a voice out of the only place where human ambition could no longer reach it. In a strange way, Saul's request was the purest expression of kingship corrupted. Even the grave was expected to answer him. The offerings belonged to that earthbound logic. Food lowered toward the opening, blood given to the dust. Small objects perhaps meant to entice attention from below. These details have to be imagined carefully, because the point is not spectacle. The point is weight. A knife drawn across an animal throat does not sound cinematic in a low room. It sounds wet and abrupt. The smell hits first. Warm iron. Fear. The animal's body heat breaking into the cooler air. Blood sinks into dirt differently than water. It darkens the floor, clumps the dust, makes the earth look briefly alive. If there was a small ladder or ritual object lowered into the pit, it would not have looked mystical. It would have looked almost childlike. And that is what makes it worse. The living building furniture for the dead. Saul watched from behind his disguise, but the disguise had become meaningless. Nothing in that room cared about his clothes. Not the pit, not the silence, not the woman whose life balanced on his oath. He had spent the night trying to hide from men, and had reached the one place where the earth itself might recognize him. There is a peculiar cruelty in the fact that Saul's last religious act required cooperation, not with a priest he honored, not with a prophet who chose him, with someone he had made illegal. Despair often forces the powerful to depend on the exact people they made invisible. The sick tyrant needs the servant he never learned to name. The general needs the local guide whose village his army burned. Saul needed the woman at Endor. And for the first time in the story, she controlled the room. Then something happened that even she did not expect. The text gives the moment almost violently. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. Not a ritual phrase, not a controlled performance, a scream. The detail matters because professionals do not scream at their own tricks, even if the medium had practiced deception before, even if she knew how to mimic voices from the belly, even if she had dealt in minor shades, familiar spirits, frightened clients, and the theater of forbidden knowledge. This broke the category. Something came through the opening that did not belong to her, not a manageable whisper, not a rented ghost. Samuel. Her scream also protects the scene from becoming propaganda. If the story only wanted to condemn a cult practice, it could have made the woman a fraud or a demonized villain. Instead, it gives her terror. Terror is evidence. It tells us she did not control the result. She may have known the gestures, the pit, the offerings, the murmured words, the professional mask required when clients came shaking to her door, but the thing in the room overmatched the ritual. It is as if a village physician opened a wound expecting pus and found the ocean pressing on the other side. Her scream tore through the low room and made Sheol's body betray him. The servants would have reached for weapons before remembering no weapon solves a ghost. The lamp flame shuddered. Dust floated in the air like ash after a collapse. The woman turned on Saul and named the hidden fact.
"Why have you deceived me? You are Saul!"
That recognition is the hinge of the entire night. She does not identify him by his face first. She identifies him because the scale of the apparition reveals the scale of the petitioner. Ordinary men do not accidentally summon national prophets. Ordinary fear does not drag Samuel up from Sheol. The dead man's arrival unmasks the living king. Saul had tried chaffis, concealment, but the underworld gave him away, and still, Saul could not see what she saw. That is another brilliant cruelty in the narrative. The woman sees first Saul, the king, the warrior, the man who demanded the ritual, is dependent on her description like a blind man in his own judgment scene. He asks what she sees. Her answer reaches for the strongest word available, Elohim rising from the earth. Not gods in the cheap sense, not a crowd of deities climbing out of a hole. A godlike one, a majestic, terrible presence coming up from below. So weighty that ordinary human language buckles under it. The shape is almost painfully simple. An old man, covered with a mantle. That mantle was enough. Saul knew. The garment that had once signified prophetic authority now returned crusted with the underworld. The mantle itself carried history. Earlier in Saul's life, fabric had already become a sign of rupture. When Saul tore the edge of Samuel's robe, Samuel told him the kingdom had been torn from him. Cloth became verdict. Now, in Endor, the medium describes an old man wrapped in a mantle, and Saul understands that the torn fabric of his life has returned whole enough to accuse him. The garment is not costume. It is continuity. The same prophetic authority that rejected him in daylight has risen in darkness, and it has not softened with time. Samuel did not need a face. He needed only the outline of the office Saul had betrayed. There are moments when recognition does not arrive through sight, but through dread. Saul bowed with his face toward the ground, and the posture was not worship in any comforting sense. It was gravity. A living king lowering himself before a dead prophet who had more authority in a mudroom than Saul possessed in his camp. Then Samuel spoke. "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" The word behind disturbed is not mild. It carries agitation, quaking, provocation, the anger of something violently disrupted. Samuel is not a glowing messenger with soft edges. He is not grateful to be consulted. He has been dragged out of the heavy quiet of death by the man who refused the living warning. His voice, if you strip away centuries of church art, should not sound heavenly. It should sound dry, ancient, like stone dragged across stone in a burial chamber. A voice unused to air, a voice that had no intention of returning. Saul answered like a man who had finally run out of throne language. "I am in great distress. The Philistines are fighting against me. God has turned away from me. He no longer answers me by prophets or dreams. So I called you to tell me what I should do." There it is, naked at last. Not doctrine, not strategy, need. Saul did not want rebellion, he wanted relief. He wanted one voice in the universe to break the pressure in his skull. And because the audience is human, This is the dangerous moment. It is easy to condemn Saul when he is throwing spears. It is harder when he is asking a dead man what to do, because every approved channel has gone dark. That is the hidden question the story smuggles into the room. How long would you obey a boundary if the silence on your side of it felt like death? Samuel gives him no loophole. Why do you ask me? Since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy. The sentence lands with the cruelty of confirmation. Saul did not need information. He needed denial. He needed Samuel to tell him the silence meant delay, discipline, testing, anything except abandonment. But Samuel does the one thing the living court could no longer do. He tells the truth without managing Saul's reaction. The kingdom has been torn from you and given to David. The Amalekite disobedience still stands. The old verdict still stands. The consequences you outran for years did not expire. They waited. Samuel's prophecy is terrifying because it contains almost nothing new. Saul already knows the pieces. David. Rejection. Divine silence. Philistine pressure. What Samuel provides is not revelation, but final arrangement. He places the facts in a line from which Saul can no longer escape. Notice the precision of the cruelty. Samuel does not flatter Saul by treating the ritual as the central offense. He does not waste the encounter explaining why necromancy is forbidden. The crime of the night matters, but it is not the root. The root is older. Obedience refused. Violence rationalized. Warning despised. Spiritual channels destroyed by the man who later complained that no channel remained. Samuel's speech reaches past the pit to the pattern. That is why it sounds less like a new accusation, and more like the reading of a sealed document Saul signed years before. Then comes the sentence that kills him before the sword does. Tomorrow, you and your sons will be with me, not defeated, not wounded, not forced to retreat. With me, in Sheol, in the dust, in the speechless country below the floor. The phrase has no cinematic thunder, and that is why it is unbearable. It is intimate. It gives Saul a location. It tells him that by the next sunset, the boundary he has torn open will receive him from the other side. His sons are included, which means the punishment is not merely personal. Dynasty will descend with him. The future will be dragged into the same dark. A battlefield death allows a man to imagine motion until the end. A prophecy like this removes motion. Saul cannot negotiate with morning. He cannot outrun tomorrow because tomorrow has already been described by someone who came from where it leads. That is the true horror of the Endor incident. Not that the dead can speak, that the dead may speak with certainty. The king's body responded before kingship could invent a pose. He collapsed full length on the ground. Not a graceful bow, not a symbolic fall, a biological shutdown, a heavy, sudden loss of muscle and command. The nervous system has limits, and Saul had spent the night burning through all of them. Fear, fasting, sleep deprivation, moral contradiction, the smell of blood, the scream of the medium, the sight of the prophet by description, the words tomorrow and with me. The body can carry terror for only so long before it pulls the emergency cord. Heart rate drops, blood pressure falls, the brain loses its grip on light, the limbs empty. A king becomes weight. The sound would have been ugly. Cloth dragging, knees striking first, or perhaps the shoulder, then the torso, dust lifting from the floor and clinging to sweat. The same earth opened for Samuel now catching Saul's face. There is a clinical coldness to that fall. But there is also a moral image inside it. Saul, who once stood above priests and decided who would live, is now horizontal on the floor of a woman he almost certainly would have condemned. Power has changed planes. Vertical authority collapses into horizontal helplessness. The king is no longer the one issuing decrees. He is the problem other people must solve before the night can continue. The body always democratizes the powerful eventually. Hunger, fainting, blood pressure, breath. These do not care about titles. For a moment, nobody moved. The servants did not know whether touching him would be disobedience or mercy. The woman, whose life he had threatened without admitting it, stood over the body of the man who once made her existence illegal. This is the point where most stories would turn the medium into an avenger. They would let her spit on him, laugh, leave him there in the dirt. But the biblical narrative gives her something stranger and more human. She comes near. She sees that he is terrified. She sees that he has eaten nothing all day and all night. And she urges him to take food. The woman Saul hunted becomes the caretaker of Saul's final hours. There may not be a more unsettling act of mercy in the entire episode. It is not sentimental. She is probably still afraid. The room still stinks of blood and disturbed soil. The night is not safe. The apparition's words still hang in the clay walls. But she has crossed from victim to witness, and witnesses often inherit responsibilities they never asked for. She tells him she obeyed his voice and put her life in her hands. Now he must obey hers. Eat. Live long enough to leave. Saul refuses at first. That refusal is not noble. It is the inertia of a man already half inside the sentence. Food belongs to people with futures. The mouth has no interest in bread when the mind has been shown the grave. But his servants join her, and together they do the one thing left that can still be done for a condemned body. They make it stand back up. The meal that follows is grotesque because it uses the materials of celebration. The woman has a fattened calf in the house, an animal of value, the kind preserved for honor, joy, return, feast. She kills it in the middle of the night for a king who is no longer a guest in any meaningful sense. He is a man being fed on the road to execution. She takes flour, kneads it, bakes unleavened bread. The preparation of that food must be allowed to take time, because time itself becomes part of the punishment. The calf does not become meat instantly. The knife has to work. The fire has to be fed. Flour has to meet water and hand pressure. Dough has to flatten and blister against heat. Saul, who wanted a quick answer to a military crisis, is forced to sit inside the slow domestic labor of a woman outside his law. Judgment has already arrived, but the night keeps moving through ordinary tasks. That is often how catastrophe behaves. The phone call ends. The diagnosis lands. The death is confirmed. And then someone still has to wash a cup. The room fills with heat after the chill of the ritual. The smell changes from blood and damp clay to meat, smoke, scorched flour, animal fat. It should be comforting. That is what makes it obscene. Unleavened bread carries the memory of haste and deliverance, the food of people leaving death behind. Here, it is eaten in haste by a man moving toward death. A fattened calf suggests welcome. Here, it nourishes a doomed enemy. Every symbol has been inverted. The house of the forbidden woman becomes the last table of the rejected king. The meal is not communion with God. It is communion after God's silence. It is the body insisting on one more hour while the soul has already received its verdict. No one speaks much. How could they? The sounds become brutal in their smallness. Teeth tearing bread, pottery scraping dirt, a knife touching bone, Saul swallowing because the body is obedient even when the future is not. The servants avoiding each other's eyes. The woman watching the man who once inspired terror chew like someone too exhausted to be ashamed. Outside, the night waits without impatience. The Philistine fires still burn. Morning continues its approach. This scene should change how we judge the entire episode. The climax is not the apparition. It is the meal. The supernatural event gives the sentence, but the meal reveals the human ruin left behind. Saul is no longer the spear-throwing king, the failed monarch, the breaker of commands. He is a depleted organism on a floor, eating because a woman he endangered has chosen not to let him crawl out into the night on an empty stomach. Mercy does not save him. It makes his damnation visible. When he rises, there is no restoration in it. The food gives him enough strength to move, not enough hope to live. He and his men leave the house before dawn, stepping out of the low doorway into air that must have felt colder after the fire. The mud takes their footprints. The woman remains behind with the pit, the blood-dark soil, the dishes, the knowledge. She has hosted a king, summoned a prophet, survived a revelation, and fed a condemned man. By morning, history will talk about Saul and his sons and the battlefield. It will barely know what to do with her. The walk back to camp is quieter than the walk to Endor because fear has changed forms. Before, every noise was uncertain. Now certainty has made noise unnecessary. Saul knows the shape of tomorrow. His servants know enough to know they cannot ask. The hills still hold Philistine fire. The sky over Gilboa is still black, but it is the blackness before a scheduled event, not an unknown one. Somewhere, soldiers are sleeping badly, dreaming of survival. Somewhere, Jonathan is alive for the last time. Somewhere, David is not present, which may be the most important absence after God's. The kingdom is ending in multiple locations at once, but only Saul has heard the ending spoken aloud. There is a temptation to follow him to Gilboa, to give the audience the arrows, the panic, the armor-bearer, the final blade. But the Endor story resists that temptation. It tells us the battlefield is aftermath. It tells us that a man can die before he stops breathing. Saul's death occurred at the instant the future hardened into certainty and the nervous system refused to carry him. Gilboa will only make the paperwork visible. By sunrise, the armor will go back on. That detail matters. The disguise that carried him into forbidden darkness cannot carry him into public defeat. He must become the king again in order to die as one. Think of the servants fastening metal over a body that had lain full length in dirt hours earlier. Think of leather straps tightened across ribs that still remembered shallow breath. Think of the smell of Endor trapped under royal armor. Smoke, blood, unleavened bread, damp earth. The underworld hidden beneath the scent of polished war gear. The men around him may notice nothing, or they may notice everything and choose silence. Courts are built on such choices. The servants deserve a moment, too. Because their silence is not emptiness. They are the witnesses who cannot become narrators. If they tell the truth, they implicate the king, the woman, and themselves. If they bury the truth, they carry it into battle. Imagine fastening armor in the gray before dawn, while remembering the sound your king made when his body hit the floor. Imagine taking your place in formation while knowing the prophet has already placed tomorrow inside a sentence. Soldiers are trained to fear arrows. These men had to fear grammar. And Jonathan. The prophecy did not leave him out. That is where the story becomes almost unbearable. Jonathan, who loved David. Jonathan, who recognized the future more honestly than his father did. Jonathan, who stood between loyalty and truth until both sides demanded blood. Tomorrow, you and your sons will be with me. Samuel's sentence turns family into collateral certainty. Saul's private collapse will become public bereavement. The king's inability to receive the future will cost the son who could. This is not only ancient tragedy, it is the pattern of institutions that cannot metabolize succession. The founder who cannot release the company destroys the heir who could have saved it. The ruler who cannot imagine a nation beyond himself makes loyalty fatal. The father who mistakes a child's future for betrayal drags the household into his unfinished war. Saul did not simply lose a throne to David, he made the space between generations unlivable. Still, the night before the battle remains the true chamber of horror. The house at Endor contains every contradiction the story has been building: law and violation, prophet and ghost, king and fugitive, victim and host, sacred name and forbidden act, silence and answer. The medium's dwelling becomes a courtroom with no walls of stone, no judges seated in rows, no public record. The floor itself hears the case. The dead deliver the verdict. The living have to eat afterward. The deeper irony is that Saul finally got exactly what he wanted. He wanted an answer. He wanted certainty. He wanted the silence to break, and when it did, the answer destroyed the last protective ambiguity he had. That is why the story still works in the dark. Most people think they want the truth at any cost. Endor asks whether that is true, or whether uncertainty is sometimes the final mercy granted to a mind that cannot survive the completed sentence. Because the only thing worse than believing heaven has gone silent is learning that heaven was silent because the verdict had already been issued. The next morning belongs to Gilboa, but the camera should not glorify it. Keep it distant. A ridge under hard light, men moving like insects beneath standards, bronze heating under the sun, dust lifting from feet. The wet crush of bodies can remain off-screen because we have already seen the more intimate violence. We have seen a crown removed. We have seen hands dig into a floor. We have heard a dead prophet resent the summons. We have watched a king receive knowledge so total his body switched itself off. Nothing on the battlefield can improve upon that horror. When Saul falls at Gilboa, history can count the body, but Endor counted the person. The battlefield kills what remains after the mud brick house finishes its work, and that is why the woman's final image matters more than the soldiers who find Saul later. Imagine her after he leaves, the room cooling, the oil lamp guttering, the pit still dark, her hands sticky with flour, blood, and soil. Maybe she covers the opening. Maybe she cannot bring herself to touch it. Maybe she sits until dawn with the knowledge that the most powerful man in Israel came to her because his God would not answer him, and left because the dead did. No court historian could safely make her the center. No priestly retelling could comfortably honor her. So she remains unnamed, which is another kind of burial. But unnamed does not mean unimportant. In the architecture of the story, she is the threshold keeper. Saul crosses into her house as a king seeking forbidden knowledge. He exits as a condemned man with food in his stomach. Without her, the silence remains silence. With her, the silence becomes a sentence. That is power, even if history refuses to call it that. The deepest irony of the Endor incident is that Saul's final sin was also his final act of faith. He believed the boundary between worlds was real enough to cross, and he believed Samuel was real enough to answer, even after God had refused every sanctioned door. That does not excuse him. It makes him more frighteningly human. The story is not about a faithless king dabbling in darkness. It is about a man who still believed an answer existed somewhere and became willing to damn himself to hear it. That flips the whole tragedy. Saul was not destroyed because he stopped believing. He was destroyed because belief without obedience became hunger, and hunger found the one doorway mercy had kept closed. There is a modern version of that room. It is the moment you refresh a message thread you already know will stay empty. The moment you search for a diagnosis after the doctor has told you to wait. The moment you call someone who has hurt you because silence has become more painful than humiliation. It is the awful human instinct to prefer a devastating answer over the living torture of not knowing. Endor survives because most of us have stood outside some forbidden door and wondered whether peace might be hiding on the other side. So here is the question the story leaves on the floor with the dust and the blood. If every legitimate voice in your life went silent, would you choose Saul's forbidden pit and risk hearing the truth that breaks you? Or would you accept Samuel's silence and keep living inside an uncertainty that might never end? And one figure still stands in the shadow of this story, almost untouched. Abiathar, the surviving priest who escaped Saul's massacre with the ephod, carried the sanctioned voice of God into David's camp, while Saul crawled to Endor for one last answer. David held the instrument Saul had lost. The next chapter is not simply about David's rise. It is about what happens when divine silence is not universal, but selective, and when the voice one king loses begins speaking to the man who will replace him.